Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Red Bull Real Talks. Today, we'll be talking to Ken Turner, who's our VP of Brand Marketing. The Red Bull brand, as many of you know, has a long and storied history over the past 30 years. Founded by Dietrich Mateschitz back in 1987, the product expanded all across Europe until finally making its way across the pond to the US in 1997. Today, the product is available in over 167 countries in the world. While Red Bull created the energy drink market, it also offered something else to consumers, a way of life. While the can promises to vitalize the body and mind, the brand aims to give our consumers wings in different moments of need, whether that's in sports, work, school, or going out. Let's take a moment to catch up with Ken and get some info around the brand marketing department, which sits right in the middle of this product-brand intersection. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
So I want to start off by asking you about your background. So maybe walk me through kind of your career and the path you took to get to where you are today.
Yeah, definitely. So I was a finance major in undergrad, believe it or not. Started off in financial services, moved over to strategic consulting, started doing a bunch of traveling and decided to go back to business school. So I did my business school at Northwestern and then became a marketer. I spent the first 10 years of our marketing career at a company called S.C. Johnson, Raid, Ziploc, Scrubbing Bubbles, Windex, all those brands, and then got a call from Red Bull to start to understand a little bit more about this thing called brand love and can love. So I've been with Red Bull for about 3 years now, previously in a role in North Business Unit as Vice President of Marketing, and now currently Vice President of Brand Marketing out in Santa Monica.
Cool. So did you know anything about Red Bull before you joined the company, or was there something that really drew you to the organization that you were like, I want to work for Red Bull?
Actually, I did. So Red Bull is, like, from the outside world, Red Bull is it with respect to marketing. I actually knew a lot more about Red Bull and the content side of the marketing than I did about the energy drink. I mean, everyone knows the energy drink, but for me, my exposure to Red Bull was actually Red Bulletin. And so I was probably subscriber number 7
right.
to the Red Bulletin because the content was really, really amazing. As a matter of fact, it was one of the things when the recruiter, Sarah Poe, called me. It was like, hey, help me understand this. I am a loyal subscriber to the Red Bulletin, but it doesn't appear that you guys are trying to sell me any cans. So help me understand that dynamic. And she introduced me to Brand Love, which I was at, and Can Love, and how do we bridge that gap? And so from a marketer's perspective, that's a marketer's dream. When you have an opportunity to take a brand that is so powerful, so strong, and then try to understand how do you leverage and use that equity in order to increase consumption, that's like awesome, because most marketers are trying to do the other thing. They know how to sell things, but it's just not as authentic as Red Bull. And so they're trying to build a brand, and this brand's already built. So it was an amazing opportunity.
Right. So can you describe to me your current role and what a day in the life kind of looks like?
I can try. So as the head of brand from a U.S. perspective, or RBNA, we're responsible for a number of different pillars. It could be consumer collecting, cross-marketing, beverage marketing, consumer insights, or social impact. Each day can look completely different based on what it is you're trying to accomplish. But the way that I look at it is, brand's responsible for driving, reinforcing the equity. That is the essence, the foundation of our organization. But it's also responsible for understanding how to use unique levers like cross-marketing in order to drive consumption at shelf and also drive mental availability. When consumers are thinking about, I need a moment of energy, they should be thinking about Red Bull. And so there may be a lot of meetings, there may be conversations with consumers, there may be understanding of activations that are retail, there may be us walking the stores at retail to understand what we're doing, but what competition's doing. So every day is unique, every day is dynamic, but all with the goal of understanding how do we ensure that we have the right brand love, and how do we convert that brand love into can love.
Right. You've had a pretty interesting background in kind of like going across like consulting, working in that traditional tier 1 CPG company. Would you say there's been maybe one role that's really gotten you ready for the role you're in right now?
Yeah, if I had to pick an area, it would probably be I was the senior brand manager working on pesticides. So I worked on RAID. And it was the first time that I realized that our brands are so much more than the rational benefits that we provide. We're doing a focus group in LA, actually. And I listened to this woman talk about the fear that she had with respect to bugs, but the fear wasn't necessarily out of, I'll get bit. The fear was, I feel like I'm letting my family down. Mm-hmm. I am not protecting my family. That's a totally different emotional layer. And when you talk about a brand that can actually come in and meet that need from an emotional standpoint, it's huge. So from my mind, it was like, wow, up until this point, I thought about the rational benefits that brands actually develop, as opposed to the emotional needs that brands can meet. And it just kind of turned the way that I thought about brands. And for me, for a brand that is as emotional as Red Bull, when you talk about giving wings to people and ideas, that runs the gamut of the things that you can do from an actual meeting a consumer's need, either articulated or unarticulated, what that need may be.
Right. So this is an interesting question because, I mean, Red Bull, to your point that you had said before, very unique when it comes to its marketing principles, right?
Yeah.
And so historically, you know, when we thought about marketing, at least back, call it in the early 90s or late 80s, it was, you know, you had on-premise, you had kind of the field marketing component, and then maybe later on you had the culture component.
Yep.
And it seems brand marketing kind of sits in the middle of all that. So I guess the question is, what was the genesis of brand marketing? Like, how did that kind of come to be? Because that's more of a traditional CPG framework, right, and function. Yeah. Whereas Red Bull didn't necessarily start off that way, but we incorporated that afterwards. So how did that kind of come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's a question probably for the Red Bull historians, and when you have Amy Taylor in here, she can definitely right. give you a really strong answer, because I think she actually thought it. I can tell you what the role is now.
Sure.
Because for me, all the things you mentioned are still very relevant when you talk about on-premise, when you talk about on-premise marketing, when you talk about field marketing, when you talk about sampling and consumer collecting. All those are still relevant right now. All those have established what our brand foundation is, what our essence is. When a consumer hears Red Bull, things come to mind, and all that's based on everything and the exposure they've had before. The role of the brand team now, as I see it, is to make sure that there is cohesion and consistency with all those messages, so it continues to build our equity and reinforce what we've had in the past, but also build on where we want to go in the future. So that's kind of how I see it. Mm-hmm. Now, whether or not that was the idea when the brand team was developed, I don't know. But I would say that's the thought process moving forward.
Right. Would you say there's a specific set of skills that someone would need to be successful in brand marketing?
Yeah, I think, for me, there's I guess I'd call it a passion for understanding the consumer. Everything begins and ends with the consumer, from my perspective, right? Like understanding an obstacle, a reason why a consumer doesn't necessarily do what you want them to do. Understanding an insight, which is what you use to overcome that obstacle. All that relates to having ability to kind of relate to that consumer, and what I call having an empathetic ear. Mm-hmm. There are just other personalities that, for me, are table stakes. Sense of urgency is really important. Having a high level of accountability and or integrity. Having a spirit of innovation. That doesn't necessarily mean I want to create something new, but I do want to approach things, familiar problems, in a very different way. Mm-hmm. And then the last one I'd say is probably calculated risk-taking, right? And so we are a brand that's built on risks, but not just silly risks, just because, but risks that are calculated that will allow you to go farther than what you've gone before.
Right. Would you say, and you may have a biased perspective on this because of your unique career path, but is there a typical career path for a brand marketer, whether it's at Red Bull or somewhere else?
Somewhere else, probably. And then you get kind of the cookie cutter marketers, and then you get the cookie cutter executions, and then everyone looks the same, right. And it just becomes noise. But there's probably not, I would say, a typical path, right? Look at me. I was a finance dude and decided I wanted to do marketing just based on the fact that, I was actually watching one of my children when they were small, and they don't know as much about rational benefits. I mean, you can tell when they need to be changed or when they're hungry and things like that, right? But they can't talk, at least at that stage. And so you never really know because they can't really clearly articulate their needs. But you can know when there is an emotional need that needs to be met because they cry, a mom or a dad picks them up and they stop, right? Which to me is like, wow, that is the essence of an emotional need. But I was a finance background. I've seen folks who've had psychology backgrounds. I've seen folks who've had anthropology backgrounds. And it's really more how you think about the consumer and how you approach business problems.
So if someone within RBNA was interested in moving into brand marketing, what are kind of the key pieces of advice that you may give them to kind of help them on that road?
Yeah, first is discovery. You have to know what it is you're getting into, right? Like when I joined this role as kind of the VP of brand, Brian Owens, I asked him, hey, do you have a job description for the role? And what he said was, I don't have a job description, but I can tell you what it is. And he said, your role within the brand is to do everything that isn't easy to do. So there's an easy bucket and there's a not easy bucket. Anything that falls in the not easy bucket is you and your team, which is, for some people like me, sign me up, where do I go? Other people just have to do a little bit of discovery to understand that sometimes things are a little bit ambiguous, sometimes things are a little bit nebulous. When you start to deal with, as we talked about before, consumers' needs, some that are articulated and some that aren't very clear. There's frameworks you can use, but at the end of the day, it's not as cut and dry as finance or cut and dry as accounting, where there is an answer. There's so many different answers. So understanding what that is really important. And the way to do that is talk to folks who are currently on the brand team. Talk to folks who are currently in marketing. Start to understand where their pain points are. Start to understand where they really, really love what they're doing. And then try to envision yourself kind of in that role. But also you need to be clear on what it is you want to do and what it is you want to accomplish. Like one of the things that I started doing really, really early, and it's a little bit nerdy, is I started to keep a career journal. So I would say for the past 15 years, every Friday, I spend an hour and a half writing in that journal. What did I accomplish last week? What is it that I want to do next week? And then on I would say quarterly basis, I take a day and a half and just review what happened the last quarter, review what I want to do the next quarter, and then once a year, I'll take all that and start to think about 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road, so I can clearly articulate what it is I want to do and clearly articulate, at least from my perspective, where my career is heading. Those types of things are important. I mean, that's important for any career, but in order to continue to do what it is you want to do, you need to be able to meet expectations, sometimes exceed. You need to have someone who's going to help you. You need to be able to clearly articulate what it is you want to do. And so if you kind of combine those things, you start having the right conversations, then you may find out that brand is a team for you.
Yeah, career journal. I mean, that's such a great idea. I mean, it's the little things that make you successful, right? And the consistency of doing something like a career journal every week, that must have really helped a lot. And what a great idea for someone just starting off their career, right?
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
So last question, if you were to give, say, just one piece of advice to somebody who's just kicking off their career at Red Bull, what would that piece of advice be?
Yeah, I'm going to borrow advice if I can do that. So it's advice that I actually got from, believe it or not, Colin Powell. So not that Colin Powell and I are hanging out or anything like that. I just happened to see him at a conference, and I asked him a question about his career, and there were two pieces of information he gave me. One was, you don't necessarily need as much information as you think in order to make a decision. And I mean, that's coming from a 5-star general who has lives in his hand, right? And so it's like, that's interesting. The other piece of advice that he gave me, which I would not take with a grain of salt, but I really consider it. It's like, if you want to be successful in your career, figure out what everyone else is doing and don't do that. Because if you do what everyone else is doing, then you look like everyone else. And the people who are successful, at least from his perspective, find a way to do things differently. And that advice was given to me a long time ago, and it's still the advice I give today when people ask me, hey, starting off in my career, what is it that you would think about? Decision making from the information and figuring out what you want to do differently.
Ken, that was amazing. Thank you
Awesome.
so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
it.